In the third episode of this tutorial series, we'll make the floating stones that surround the top of our portal, as well as add some remaining details like glowing runes and broken cobblestones on the ground. Settle in, this episode will be a bit longer than the rest, but we'll be making a ton of progress. If you find yourself enjoying this tutorial, consider checking out my premium classes on Skillshare. I'm excited that I can offer everyone a completely free month of premium Skillshare membership by using the link in the description and comments below. I have 9 unique classes focused on many different aspects of Blender, like my Create a Cartoon Bumblebee animation class. With that out of the way, let's proceed with the tutorial. We're going to start by creating the floating stones that surround the top half of our portal. So to begin with, we're going to hit Shift and A to bring up our Add menu. Then we can go to Mesh and then Cube. So after choosing Cube, we can now go down here to the bottom left, and then we're going to change the size. Right now it's a lot bigger than we need, so we're going to set this down to 0.3 and then hit enter so that it's a 0.3 meter cube. With the size changed, we can now go up here to the top right, and then we're going to rename this so we can just double click where it says cube. We're going to call this Portal Stone and then hit enter. Now let's go into our front view by either clicking on this little negative Y bubble up here on the top right, or we can hit tilde and then choose front from our radial menu. Okay, so now that we're in the front view, we're going to lift this stone up. We're going to move it up above the portal using the Z handle to make sure it goes just in the Z direction. And we want to basically leave enough of a gap here below it that it's pretty much the same as the bottom. So on the sides here, it widens a little bit, but we're looking for a gap here between the bottom of this portal stone and the top of the actual portal, about as large as it is on the bottom. So maybe I'll move this down just a little bit. This doesn't need to be perfect. We just want to make sure that visually it's pretty similar and that it's definitely not touching. We don't want it to be, so close that after we do some animation on this actual portal itself, that this portal moves into the stone. So I'm going to move mine up so that there's roughly the same amount of distance. Now let's start editing the shape of this portal stone to make it a little bit more interesting than just a cube. So I'm going to zoom in here. I'm going to hit Tab to enter my edit mode, then 1 to enter my vertex mode, and then Alt and Z to enter X-ray mode. That way I can select through it. Let's start by drag selecting over the top of this stone, just selecting the top vertices. And we're going to move them upward so that the stone is roughly twice as tall as it was. This doesn't need to be perfect. We just want it to be roughly about as tall, or twice as tall as it used to be. So somewhere around here is probably fine. Now let's scale up the width of the top of the stone by hitting S to start scaling, then X to bind it to the X axis. And then we're just going to move this out. And again, this doesn't need to be perfect. We're just kind of eyeing it up. So I'm going to move mine out to about here. So in this case, about 2.25 for the scale on just the X-axis. And now I'm going to drag select over just the bottom half of the stone. And I'm going to widen this up a little bit so it's not quite so tapered as it is now. So again, the same thing, S, then X to bind it to the X-axis. And just scale this up horizontally a little bit to make sure it's not quite so tapered. So around there. So in this case, about 1.36, 1.35, somewhere in there is fine. Now we can hit Control and R while hovering over near the middle of the stone. And then we can move our mouse around until we see this yellow line pop up. In my case, I had to move it down a little bit lower on the stone for it to show up. So we want to see this vertical yellow line, and when we see that, we want to actually scroll up on our mouse wheel one time to add a second cut. So now we have 2 cuts that we're about to place. Once you see 2 yellow lines, you can click once and then click again to confirm the cuts. Now with these 2 additional cuts, we can add a little bit more dimension to this stone. So let's start with the top. We're just going to drag select over just the top middle vertices here. And then we can move those up just in the Z axis. We'll move them up to about here. So we're just kind of giving the top of the stone a little bit of a rounding. And then we'll do the same thing on the bottom, except we're going to do it a little bit less, not quite so round. So we'll just move these up just a little bit, right around here. So just a small rounding on the bottom, and then a more significant one on the top. With that done, let's rotate our viewport so we go back into our perspective view. And now we're going to drag select just over the bottom half of this stone. So we want to make sure we have all of the vertices on the bottom half selected. And then we're going to hit S and then Y instead. So in this case, we're actually going to be thinning the bottom of the stone. So we're tapering it the other way than we were before. So we're just going to taper this in just a little bit, just to add a little bit of dimension to these stones so they're not perfectly flat on the front. And again, you can see down here, it was about 0.7 roughly that I scaled it inward on just the y-axis on the bottom. Now let's go back into our front view. Again, either the -y bubble or tilde and then front. We can hit Alt and Z to exit our X-ray mode. We won't need that for right now. And then we can also hit Tab to exit our edit mode because we're done shaping this stone for now. Now we can begin duplicating this stone around the portal so that it's not just a single stone at the very top. So to make our duplicate, we're going to hit Shift and D with this stone selected. So now we have a duplicated copy and we just need to choose where we're going to place it. So we're going to place it roughly here. So about, I'm not even sure exactly which direction it is, maybe about 40 degrees here. We're going to place it down here to the bottom left, and then we are going to rotate this actually. So to rotate this, rather than using the rotate tool, because we're in this orthographic view, we're in this front view, we don't need to worry about it rotating it based on our screen because our screen is actually at the correct orientation. So we can just hit R to begin rotating, and we know that we're not rotating it kind of, you know, tilted on any axis or anything. It's directly from the front, so it'll be nice and straight. And while we're rotating this, we can hold down Control to snap it to a degree. So it's not just arbitrarily moving it 1 degree at a time, it's actually snapping by 5. So we can see that up here at the top left. You'll have to disregard what the stone is doing, but up here at the top left, you can see where it says rotation. In this case, it says, you know, -130. But if I move it back to where I want it to, I'm going to move mine to about -40 degrees. So we'll rotate it about here. And now we can reposition the stone to make the bottom of this curve kind of match the curvature of the portal as well. Now it won't be exact because this portal has kind of a wavy edge, but just try to eye it up. So I'm going to move mine to about here, trying to maintain a similar size gap between them, and then also match the curvature of the bottom of the stone to the curvature of the portal. With the stone roughly in place, let's scale it down as well. So we're going to make each one of these stones slightly smaller as it goes down the side of the portal. So let's hit S to start scaling this one. And we're just going to scale this down just an arbitrary size because we're actually going to type in a number here. So just scale it down roughly smaller. And then down here, we're actually going to type in a number for this. So in order to highlight each one of these all at the same time and then just type in a number once, we can click and drag on the top one and drag down to the bottom. So you're going to click and hold on the top, drag down to the bottom to highlight all 3 of them. And now if I type in 0.75 and then hit enter, it'll change all 3 of these numbers. Alternatively, if you find that a little bit tedious or annoying, you can just go through each one and type in 0.75, and that'll do the exact same thing. It just requires you typing it in 3 times. With our scale changed, we actually need to move it in a little bit closer to the portal, and we could probably move it up a little bit so that the curvature matches a little bit better. So after you scale it down, just try to reposition it so that it still feels correct for the placement on the portal. Now let's begin the process of making the last 2 stones for the left side. So with the second stone selected, we're going to hit Shift and D. Let's duplicate it down here. We're going to need to leave room for one more stone down here, which will be smaller, so we won't need quite as much of a gap. We need to leave a space here for it. We're going to hit R to start rotating it, and then hold Control down to make sure you're snapping. In my case, I'm going to rotate it to about -20, which we can see up here at the very top left of my screen. And then we're going to scale this down. However, we're going to do it a little bit different than the last time. So this time we're going to hit N to bring up our side menu over here. We want to make sure that we're on the Item tab. And then down here we can see the scale. So this scale is a little bit different than the scale we saw at the bottom left when we scaled down the first stone. So that scale was determined based on the last item we had selected. In this case, this item here was set to 1 scale, and then we scaled it down to 0.75. However, if we start scaling this, so you don't need to follow along with this, but if I just start scaling this down, and then I scale it down to some arbitrary size, we can see down here it says 0.653, However, over here it says 0.489. And the reason being, the scale on the right side here is relative to the original 1 scale of the object. So if this is considered 1, this object is slightly under half the scale of the original size of the object. However, the number down here at the bottom left, this is relative to just the scale operation that we just did. So in this case, since we had an object that was this size and we scaled it down, arbitrarily, we scaled it down to 0.65 of what the original size was set. So if I scale this down again, it'll just be a different number here. You can see actually I made it smaller. However, this number went up. On the right side though, we can see that this number did go down. So this is sort of like the absolute scale of the object, and this is kind of the relative scale just on a per operation basis. So rather than relying on the number down here at the bottom left, which kind of is all over the place, we're going to use these numbers here on the right. So the size we want to use over here on the right, again, is the same thing. We're going to click and drag on the top one and then drag down to highlight all 3. And then we're going to type in 0.6 and then hit enter. So remember on the second one that we did, this was set to 0.75. And then the first one is also set to 1. So now we can see there's a kind of an obvious progression downward for each of these. Using the scale over here on the side menu isn't something you always have to do. It won't always matter that they're going down incrementally from the original scale of the object, but in this case, since we want a progression going downward, each one getting slightly smaller than the last, and we want them to be somewhat even in the way that they scale down, it makes more sense to use this scale rather than the relative scale at the bottom left. Now let's make one last stone. We're going to hit Shift and D to make a duplicate with the smallest stone selected. We're going to move it down here. Then we can hit R to start rotating, hold Control while we're rotating it to snap. In this case, roughly about -20 seems correct again. Just try to make sure that these are placed. So I'm going to actually move this one up a little bit to give a little bit more of an equal spacing between these. And again, just make sure you're looking at the gap between these. It is a little difficult to make sure that they're all equally spaced from the portal because the portal is so irregular, but just do your best. Okay, and now let's scale this last stone down. And again, we're going to be doing it over here instead of the bottom left. So in this case, we can just click and drag on the top, drag down to highlight all 3, and then we're going to type in 0.45 and then hit enter. This might require you to reposition the stone a little bit, maybe even rotate it if it seems like it's off rotation a little bit. I actually rotated mine an additional -5 degrees to the left or downward. Okay, and then just go through here quick and just respace all of them. Maybe change the rotation on some of them if they seem a little off, and just get it to a point that you're happy with. Okay. So once you're happy with the placement, the size, and the rotation of the stone to the left, now let's duplicate them over to the right. The easiest way for us to do this is to select one of the stones here, and then hold down Shift and select the other 2. We don't have to worry about the top stone here because there's only one of them. We don't need to make the duplicate of that. Now with all 3 stones selected, we can hit Shift and D to begin making a duplicate. But now we can hit X to make sure that it moves it only on the X axis. And that will make sure that when we move these over and then flip them, they're exactly the same level horizontally as the others were. So let's just move them over roughly over here. We're going to have to move them again either way. So just place them roughly around here. And now we're going to hit R, then Z. So we're rotating it just on the Z axis. And then we're going to type in 180 and then hit enter. So all we did really was just move them over after making the duplicates and then rotate them so that it flips them around. So in this case, we're actually seeing the back side of these stones, but it doesn't really matter yet because we haven't done any changes to them. So the back side of these stones are functionally identical to the front side. Now that we have the duplicates made, we can just move them over just on the X-axis with our move tool and move them roughly to the same spacing as the first side. So the thing I'm actually looking at here when I'm lining them up is I'm making sure this point here is roughly where it is on this stone. So this corner here basically meets up with the point. I'm doing the same thing on this side. So about there. Now if I zoom out a little bit, I can see that my portal is nicely centered between the gap that these stones make between them. Now that we have our stones made, let's go through each stone one by one and start chipping them to make them a little bit more interesting and give them a little bit more wear and tear like we did for the base of the stone portal. I'm going to walk you through how I do the very top one here, so the top center, and then I'll speed up the process here for these side ones because it's basically the same. So I'll just play the video back really quickly and then you can catch up once you're ready. So with my top stone selected, I'm actually going to go into my perspective view just by rotating my viewport. I can zoom into this stone. Then we can hit Tab to enter our edit mode, and then 1 to make sure that you're in your vertex mode. You don't need to be in your X-ray mode for this. It's actually probably better that you're not. So if you're in X-ray, so if yours looks like this, just hit Alt and Z to exit that, or just click this little button up here, which is just the visual button for that. Okay, so now we're not in X-ray mode. We're just going to go through each one of these vertex here and just decide if we want to chip it like the method that we did on the stone base using the bevel tool, or if we'll just leave it as it is. So I'll start up here with this top corner. I'm going to hit Control B to start beveling. And again, you'll remember bevel doesn't do anything on a vertex until you hit V after hitting Control B. And now that it's beveling, we can just decide how wide to make this bevel, how chipped is this edge. I'm going to make this relatively chipped. I'll move it out to about here. And now I'm going to select this bottom vertex, hit G once, and then hit G again to make sure that I'm moving it only along this edge. And I'm just going to slide this down to make this chip a little bit longer. Okay. We can also select one of these beveled vertex that we just created and then do the exact same process to make the bevel and the chipping a little bit more interesting. So I'll just select this one here. Hit Control B, then V, and then just bevel this one out as well. So I'm just making this bevel a little bit more rounded here. Okay, let's just pick a couple more on this. And again, this is the front side of the stone that we're beveling now. In this case, it probably does make sense to bevel some of the back side here, at least the corners, because the angle that we're going to be taking this render from is kind of from the side, so you do actually see the back side. It'll look a little bit weird if you only go through and chip just the front side of your stones, and then the back sides are perfectly flat and pristine. So I'm going to start up here, bevel this top one, Control B, Control V, or sorry, Control B, then just V. Move that to here, and then just widen this with G 2 times so that it's sliding it. So let's just go around here. I'm going to speed up this process for this chipping of this stone here. You don't need to see me chip each edge, but you understand the process now, so just do the same thing on your top stone for now. Okay, so I have my first stone, the very top center one, fully chipped. You can see I went through here on the backside and just chipped off mostly the corners. The backside doesn't quite matter so much on the very top center and the bottom center, but if you're going to chip anything on the backside, I would probably focus on like the bottom corners and then maybe the top corners as well. And you can see I also did some of the double chipping here. So I beveled again on top of a bevel to make a little bit more of an interesting chip here, as well as on the front. You saw that already. So once you're done chipping this stone, now you can hit Tab to exit your edit mode, and then you're just going to go through and do this exact same process on each of the stones. Be careful as you go through and chip each of these stones that you're not making them too similar to each other. Try to look at the last one you did and just kind of get a collective view of all the stones you've done and try to vary your chipping as much as you possibly can. I know there's not a whole lot of variety in what you can do with this method. Just try to not make sure that you're heavily chipping the top right corner every single time, and then you're not chipping the top left corner at all. Try to vary like which ones you're heavily chipping. If you're going to chip the centers like I did here, maybe try to vary on, whether it's the top left or the bottom right, switch it back and forth. Sometimes don't chip anything on the top centers. Just do your best to vary each of your stones as much as possible. So I'll see you here in a minute after I've gone through each one of these stones and chipped each one individually. So you're going to have to select them, hit Tab to enter your edit mode, make sure you're in vertex mode, go through each one of these vertex, decide whether you're chipping it and how much, and then once you're done chipping it, hit tab to exit, select your next stone, and then same process, tab to enter it, 1 to make sure you're in vertex, and then just go through and chip each one. So I'll see you in a minute once I'm done. Okay, so I have all of my portal stones chipped. However, there's still one last step we can add just like last time. We need to add a bevel modifier to soften all these edges on the stones. We're going to start by selecting one of our smallest stones. In this case, I'll select my right stone. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so I can get a better look at it. And the reason we want to select the smallest stone is because it's the one that's the most likely to have potential overlap. So if we're going to be applying the exact same bevel modifier to all of these stones and we want to make them, consistent, we need to make sure that they work for the smallest stone, and then the biggest stone will just use whatever the smallest stone can use. So over here on our modifier panel, we're going to go to add modifier and then choose bevel. And now just like the bevel modifier we applied to the stone base, we're going to change some of these settings. So let's start by twirling open the geometry as well as the shading. And then we're going to go up here to the top and we're going to set the amount to 0.005 and then hit enter. So we can see it's a relatively small bevel, but again, this is with the intention of making sure that it works for the smallest one, and then we'll just apply it to the rest. So we have 0.005 for the amount. Now we can go to the segments and set that to 2 to make sure it has a little bit more rounding. For the angle, we can just set this to 0. That way it bevels every single edge and it doesn't exclude any. We're going to go down here to the bottom and choose clamp overlap. We're going to uncheck that. That way it also bevels edges that it would have otherwise limited. And then the last thing, we just need to check harden normals. And this, we won't see anything right away, but we do have to enable auto smooth now. So now with these settings done, we can go over to our object data properties, which is this little green triangle. Click that, go down to normals. So we're going to twirl this section open here, and then we can check auto smooth. And now with our auto smooth turned on, we can see that the bevels that we added are nice and smooth on each of these corners. So it gives it a very similar look to what our stone base had. Now let's copy this bevel modifier we just applied to the small stone to all the other portal stones. And we can do this without having to go through each one, go to our modifier panel, add the bevel modifier, and then type in all those same parameters. We can just duplicate it from this stone itself. So to start with, let's zoom out so we can see all the stones. Make sure you have nothing selected just by clicking off of any of the objects here into the gray. So I have nothing selected. And I'm going to start by selecting all of these stones except for the one that's beveled. We want to select that one last. So I'm just going to start on the opposite side. So I'm just going to hold down Shift, select this first stone, and then go through and just, while holding down Shift, select each one of these, and then I'm going to select the beveled stone, the very last one. Okay. Now we can hit Control and L with all these stones selected to bring up our link menu. We're going to go down here to the bottom and choose Copy Modifiers. Now, after we choose Copy Modifiers, we can deselect one of these stones and then select it again, and we can see that this modifier has been applied to every single one of these stones, and we didn't have to do it individually for each one. It just took the original bevel modifier from the small one and applied it to each of the stones that we had selected before. The only caveat here is we'll notice that it didn't take the auto smooth that this one had set. So each one of these still has the warning that the auto smooth is not turned on. So we're going to have to do that individually. Luckily, that's relatively easy. So we're just going to start with one of these stones that doesn't currently have it turned on. We can go down here to our object data properties, this little green triangle, where we see normals down here at the bottom, and then just check auto smooth. And we can stay on this tab for each one. And we're just going to select the new stone, click auto smooth. And you can see how much quicker this is than actually applying the bevel modifier for each one individually. So while it doesn't automatically do it for us, it's a relatively easy fix. So now we have every one of our stones beveled and auto smoothed. Now that the floating portal stones are done, let's make a unique magic rune that'll be applied to the front of each one. We'll start by hitting Shift and A to bring up our add menu. We're going to go to Mesh, and then we're going to choose Cube. Due to the method that we'll be using to make these portal runes, it doesn't really matter what size this cube is. So we can disregard that, and then we're just going to go up here to the top right, and we're going to rename this from cube to portal rune, and then hit enter. Now we can move this portal rune object up here in front of the top center portal stone. So we're going to move it roughly to the center of it. It doesn't need to be perfect, just kind of in the middle. And then we're going to move it forward so that this orange rune here, or this orange circle here rather, this dot, is in front of the stone. So again, we'll remember that the negative Y side, so this side here, is the front of the portal. Okay, so I have this cube moved just in front of this stone here. At least the origin, the little orange dot is. Now we can go into our front view by either clicking the negative Y bubble or hitting tilde and then choosing front view. Let's zoom in here. We're going to hit tab to enter our edit mode, then 1 to enter our vertex mode. And again, this is with the portal rune object selected, this little cube. And then we can hit A to make sure we have all of the vertices selected. So we want to have every single one of these vertices selected, and we can do that by hitting the A key, and that'll just select all of pretty much anything. So if we were outside of this object, not in the edit mode, it would just select every object in our scene. Or if we were in face mode for this, it would select all the faces and so on. So now with all of our vertices selected, we can hit M on our keyboard, and then we're going to choose Merge at Center. So what we've done is essentially merge down this entire cube into a single vertex right in the center of itself. And the reason we're doing that is because we're going to be using a modifier that really is only looking for vertices. We don't actually need any geometry for it to make these runes. So the easiest way for us to make a single vertex for this modifier to use is just by making a cube and then crushing it down until it's just a single vertex right in the center. Now let's add the modifier that's going to recreate the geometry for the magic rune. So we're going to go over here to the right side and go to our modifier tab, this little blue wrench, choose add modifier, and then we're going to add a skin modifier. So we'll click this. Now we can see right away, it's basically recreated the cube for us. Now, while it looks like we haven't really accomplished anything by adding the skin modifier on top of it and just recreating the cube that we kind of destroyed before, the skin modifier is going to allow us to create new vertices, and then the skin modifier will create geometry between each one of those vertices. So it's going to make our jobs a lot easier, basically just being able to, click and drag vertices and drag them out and make new additions to that line, and then letting the skin modifier handle all the geometry around it rather than having to do it by hand. The only thing that we're going to have to change on the skin modifier is just check smooth shading, and that'll ensure that once we actually apply the next modifier, that it's not looking really faceted and kind of low poly. So there's just one more modifier we need to add. So we can go up here to add modifier, and then we're going to go down to subdivision surface and apply that. And this is just going to crush this down from a square into more of a round shape. And we can make it more round by changing the levels on the smoothing here for both the viewport and the render. So let's set these both to 3. That way it's nice and smooth. With our modifiers set up, let's hit Alt and Z to go into our X-ray mode so it's a little bit easier to see what we're doing. And we're going to need to see the vertex in between the skin modifier. So now we can just drag select over the center of this to make sure we have that single vertex selected. And we're going to hit Control and A, which is kind of a weird keybind. It's basically unique to the skin modifier here. So we're going to hit Control and A, and that'll allow us to start scaling down this vertex. And you can see that little red circle actually changes as well. And that little red circle bit there is basically marking like the root of this skin modifier. So we're going to scale this down relatively small here. We'll scale it down to about here. So it's just a small dot now in the center. And again, that was Control and A that scaled it down, not S. That's kind of a weird, very specific keybind for this. Now the next thing we need to do is turn on something called snapping. We're going to go up here to the top, and it looks like this, kind of like a little magnet here. So we're going to turn that on by clicking it, and that'll turn it blue, and it kind of turns the magnet on essentially. And then we can change the options for our snapping. So what snapping does is it basically, you can give it a whole bunch of different parameters, and it's going to snap whatever you're selecting to whatever that parameter is. In this case, we want this vertex that we're moving around and scaling and making duplicates of to snap to the surface of the stone behind it. That way, that sort of slightly slanted surface that we made on the portal stone behind it is going to have the rune applied directly to it. It won't be floating off the surface of it. So now that we're in our options on this drop-down menu here, we're going to choose Face Project, which means it's projecting these objects we're moving. It's snapping them to the faces themselves. We're going to leave it on Closest. And then we're going to go down here to the bottom and we're going to choose Project Individual Elements. That basically just means that as we're moving around these vertex, if we move two at the same time, it's going to project each of them individually. So if one is a little bit higher in the stone and it needs to be pushed out further so it doesn't intersect, it'll move just that specific vertex out a little bit to prevent it from intersecting. And then we can leave these three highlighted as they are, and then we can leave it Affect Move as well. And now with these settings turned on, we can go back to our skin modifier here, and we're just going to move this down here to the bottom. So this first rune here, I'm going to walk you through the shape that the first rune I'm making is. You don't have to follow along exactly. Each one of these runes that you make can be completely unique. You don't have to follow along with me if you don't want to. But if you don't have any specific ideas of what you'd like to show on these portal stones, you can follow along and just make the runes that I'm making. Now that I have it down here at the bottom left corner, I'm going to hit E to start extruding. And I'm going to extrude it up here to the top. So you can see as we hit E to extrude, it's actually just making more geometry between it. So it's going to be really easy for us to just quickly kind of click out a shape and then go through and refine the shape rather than having to do this all by hand like we would have had to do if we didn't use the skin modifier. So now with this top vertex selected, I'm just going to hit E again. I'm going to make kind of a star shape. Maybe it's like a star or like an A or something like that. So we're just hitting E again, and we're just hitting E each time we want to add another extension to this line. So we'll move it up to here. So now I have this kind of star sort of modified A shape, but it's not particularly pleasing looking because it's kind of just all the same thickness and it's all really blobby. Now we can go through each point and scale it down or up to make the shape a little bit more interesting. So let's start down here at the bottom. I'm just going to select this vertex here, and then we can move it down so that it fills the shape up a little bit better. I'm going to zoom in so it's a little bit easier to see. And then I can hit Control and A on just this vertex here, and you can see that I can scale it up or down, and it will taper it into the next vertex. So let's scale this one up a little bit thicker. And I'm going to select this top corner here and hit Control A and scale this one down so that the line kind of tapers going into it. I'm almost going for a little bit more of like a calligraphy look for these, almost as if they were written with like a thick quill pen or something like that. So we'll scale this one down. And maybe we'll drag over the bottom one here, hit Control A. We'll scale this one down just a little bit smaller. And then let's make it really heavily taper here at the end. So I'm going to select the very last one on this line, Control A, scale this one down a good bit. So I really want it to come to kind of a point here. We'll select this corner here, and then we'll also scale this one down as well. Okay, so now I have the sort of the general thickness that I'd like to see. Maybe I'll scale this one down a little bit smaller. So with these scaled down, I can move around and kind of change the shape of this symbol. Maybe I want to make it a little bit more angular here. Maybe make it more like an arrow. Okay. So I'm pretty happy with that shape. But let's say I wanted to make a shape that isn't just a single line. So I want to actually have like an extra dash up here. To do that, I'm going to select this part of the line here. So I'm going to select this one, just drag select over this, and then hold Shift and drag select this part of the line here. Now it didn't really specifically matter where I selected as long as one of the vertex that I selected had this red circle around it. If I just decided to select maybe this longer line here instead, and I duplicated this, it would lose the skin modifier because it doesn't include the root. Each one of these lines, if they're not attached to a root, they're not going to display anything. So to make sure that this second line actually displays some geometry, I need to make sure I select at least a portion of the line that has a root, and then I can adjust it from there. So I have this one here selected because it has the root on it, this little red circle, and then just any other one that's connected to it. So now with those two selected, I can hit Shift and D to duplicate them up here. And now you can see I have a second line here. And now I'm free to edit this second line however I'd like to. So maybe we'll flip the way this is. So right now this is thicker here and then thinner over here. So let's flip that on this side. So I'll hit Control A with this top one selected, scale that one up, and then I'll select the other side of it, hit Control A, and then scale that down. So now I can move this over here and just kind of make a more interesting shape because it has two different pieces to it. Okay, now that we're done with the shape of this first rune, we can hit Tab to exit our edit mode. And then we're going to start duplicating this specific rune around to each one of the stones. However, first let's fix the origin point of this rune. So if we rotate our viewport here to the side and then zoom back into the object, we'll notice that the origin point, this little dot here, is actually floating off the front of the rune. It's not actually centered where the rune itself is, and that's because we were moving individual vertices without any consideration as to where the origin was. Luckily, that's relatively easy to center. So now that we're outside of our edit mode and we have our rune selected, we can go up here to Object, and then Set Origin, and then Origin to Geometry. So this will move our origin to our geometry. You can alternatively do geometry to origin, but then that'll actually move your rune to where the orange dot is currently floating. That's the opposite of what we want to do. So we're going to do origin to geometry to move this dot instead to where the rune is at. We can now see that the orange dot, the origin of the geometry, is nice in the center of the rune. Let's go back to our front view so it's a little bit easier to see. Again with the -y bubble or tilde and then front. We can zoom out here, and then we're just going to duplicate this object here over to this stone. And we do want to leave our snapping on for this. So let's hit Shift D to duplicate. And we're just going to move it over so that the orange dot is roughly in the center of this stone. Doesn't need to be perfect, just roughly there. And then we can zoom in on this rune, hit Tab to begin editing, and then we can just start editing this rune shape into something totally different. Now I'm going to speed up the process here as I go through each of these runes and make them unique. Now feel free to follow along with me and just pause the video if you want to get an idea of the shape of the rune that I'm making, if you want to follow along exactly. Otherwise, just make whatever symbol looks cool to you, and then I'll see you when I'm done. And just to note, it is important that after you're done with this rune and you hit Tab to exit, that you're duplicating in the object mode rather than duplicating vertices themselves. We want individual runes, so individual rune objects for each of these stones. We don't want one single rune object with all the stones applied. We want to have individual runes that we're then going to later attach to each of these unique stones that they're meant for. So once you're done editing your rune, hit Tab to exit your edit mode, then make your duplicate and go into the edit mode on the new duplicate. I'll see you in just a moment when I'm done making all of my runes. Okay, so I have all of my runes placed on my portal, and they're all in separate models as well. If you'd like to follow along with the exact shapes that I made, now would be a good time to pause the video and just see exactly what they look like and try to replicate them. I've also exited my X-ray mode, so it's a little bit easier to see them now that we're done. Let's make sure we go up here to the top and turn off of our snapping. We won't need that anymore, and it will only make things a little bit more difficult if we have it on and we don't need it. So we're going to turn that off. Now let's go through each one of these runes and attach them to their individual portal stones. The first thing we need to do is collapse all of these runes modifiers so that they're permanent, and we actually turn them into just regular geometry, not the skin modifier and subdivision combo that they currently are. We'll also want to collapse the modifiers into our portal stones behind them as well. So there's two ways we can do this. Either we can just select them all in the viewport, or we can do it through the list on the right. I'm going to start to do mine on the list on the right. So I'm going to select my first portal rune. And in this case, portal stone is directly below it, so I can just scroll down to the very bottom here. And then I'm going to hold Shift and select the last one, and it'll select every object in between it. So in this case, I have every one of my stones and every one of the magic runes selected as well. Now that they're all selected, we can go up to Object, and then we can go to Convert, and we're going to choose Mesh. And we'll see after we do that, all those modifiers here we saw on the right side have disappeared. So if we select on any one of these objects, we can now see that there are no modifiers, and yet the object still looks just like it did before. We've just collapsed in all the modifiers that were applied to it. This step was important because if we didn't collapse the modifiers together before attaching the objects, they actually would have combined their modifiers together and created some sort of crazy combination of the two, which will more than likely not look like what we want. So it's important that we collapse the modifiers into them first and then combine the results. So let's start attaching the top rune first. So I'm going to have my actual magic rune here selected, and then I'm going to hit Shift and select the stone behind it. We want to make sure we're selecting the stone behind it because once we attach them, the attach process is going to use the last object we selected as kind of like the parent object. So it's going to take all the rotation, all the scale data and everything from that object instead, and then apply it to the newly attached object. This will be important later on when we start animating. So make sure you're selecting the rune first, then hold Shift and select your portal stone behind it last. With those selected in the correct order, we can just hit Control J and that'll attach them together. That's it. So let's go through each one of these stones and do that exact same process. Select the rune first, then hold Shift, select the stone behind it, and hit Control J. I'll see you in a second when I'm done. Okay, great. So now we have every one of our stones and runes attached together, and now they're all individual objects, but they're combined. The last piece of the portal that we need to make are what I've been calling portal bubbles. They're basically just little bubbles that float around between the portal stones. When we get to the texturing episode, we'll be making them glow the same color as the portal so they look like little particles surrounding it. So to start, we're going to hit Shift and A to create an icosphere object. So we'll go to Add menu and then Mesh, and then we're going to look for icosphere, which is essentially just a sphere made up of triangles. We can go down here and set our subdivisions to 3, which will just make it a little bit more round. And then we're going to make the radius a lot smaller. We're going to set this to 0.07 and then hit enter to make it much tinier. Let's go up here to the top right where it says icosphere. We're going to double click on that and call this portal bubble and then hit enter. And then the last thing we need to do is just right click on this object and choose shade smooth. And that'll just shade the whole thing smooth and make it look nice and smooth without adding any additional geometry. Now let's zoom out, and then we can move this bubble up here, and we're going to place it just between these two portal stones here. So our goal with these little bubbles is we're going to just clone them around somewhat randomly, but not entirely, around this portal here. We don't want to get too far away from the portal. We probably don't want to go any further than about here where my mouse is. And we're just going to kind of populate this area around with these little tiny bubbles, and then we'll be randomizing them later on. But I'll see you in a moment after I've made duplicates of this using Shift and D and just clone them around the portal. So I would try to follow along pretty closely with what I'm doing here. Now that we have all the bubbles placed, let's randomize them so that they're not all the same size and position around the portal. So the first thing we'll need to do is select each one of them. And we can do that pretty easily over here on the right side in our list. So I'm going to select the first portal bubble, scroll down the list until I find the last one right here, hold Shift, and then click the last one, and it'll select everything in between it. So now I have all of them selected. And now we can go up to the top and choose Object, Transform, and then we want to choose Randomize Transform. So this will give us some settings here that we can change to help randomize these objects that we currently have selected. So the first thing we're going to change, which is actually not something you're going to see from the front view, is we're going to change the Y location to 0.5 and then hit enter. So again, you won't notice any change here, but essentially what that's doing is moving them forward and backward a random value between 0 and 0.5. Now let's go down to the bottom for this setting that you will actually notice here. So we're going to check on scale even down here, And that'll just make sure that it's scaling them uniformly rather than squashing and stretching them in any random axis here. And we're just going to change this first number here to 0.35, which gives us a lot of sort of random variability between the sizes here. We can see that some that got a little bit bigger than they were and others got really small compared to what they were. And with the scale set to 0.35, we can see some of these bubbles got a lot smaller and other ones got a little bit too big. But overall, the appearance of these bubbles is a lot more varied than they were before, so it's more interesting. Now we can rotate our viewport so that we're back into our perspective view. And we're just going to move these forward a little bit so that they're a little bit better centered around your portal. Now in your case, your bubbles might have randomized in a way that they worked out fine. They didn't all go behind or in front. But if they did, just try to move it so that the sort of center of mass of these bubbles is right down the middle of your portal. In my case, it actually did a relatively good job, but since it's random, yours is going to be a little bit different. So just move it so that they're all kind of roughly centered on the portal. Now that we have them centered, we can go through here and fix individual bubbles that we don't really like. So some got really big or some got really small, or they moved too far forward or far back. This is a time where we can go just to each individual bubble that we don't like and kind of fine tune it and place it where we'd like to see it, or at the size we'd like to see it at. I'll see you in just a moment after I've fixed some of the scale and placement of my bubbles. I'd suggest you do the same now. Okay, so I finished fixing the bubbles here. You can see I kind of just moved them all a little bit closer. I thought the gap between them forward and backwards was a little bit too much. So I moved them a little closer. And I also got rid of some of the largest ones. I didn't mind the tinier bubbles, but some of the ones that got scaled up pretty large, I scaled those down to a more kind of normal size, basically what they were before we scaled them with the randomizer. So now we can see here, there's still a little bit of forward and backward motion on mine, but it's a little less exaggerated. And then in general, the bubbles don't get much larger than that, and then they do get pretty small still. So as long as yours looks pretty similar to this, you should be fine. So the last thing we need to do for the bubbles is actually connect them all together into one singular mesh, and that'll make our process of animating them a little bit easier later on. So let's select our first bubble here on the list, scroll down to the bottom, hold Shift, and then select the last one. So we have all of them selected, and then we can just hit Control-J. That will join them all together. And then lastly, let's just center the origin for this so it's not all the way up here at the top left. And the reason it put it up here is that's just because that was the last bubble that it selected in the list. So we're just going to go to Object, Set Origin, and then Origin to Geometry. That'll put it a little bit more in the center of where these bubbles actually are. The last thing we're going to do in this episode is make a super simple environment for our portal to exist in. Our final render will basically have our portal animated in a dark and foggy void, so we don't really need much in the way of an environment surrounding it. So let's zoom out here so we can see the rest of the scene. And we're going to hit Shift and A to bring up our add menu. We'll go to Mesh, and then choose Plane. Down here at the bottom left, we're going to change the size of this plane really large. We're going to make it 40 meters. So 40, and then hit enter. And that's just making sure that it's plenty large enough that we won't see the bounds of it. Now that we have it made, we can go over here and rename it. So where it just says plane on the top right, we can double click this and call this ground, and then hit enter. Now let's drag this plane down so it's not right in the center of our portal. We're just going to move it on the z-axis straight down, so the blue one. I'm going to move it down just to the point where it's a little bit below where the last chip was, so the lowest chip on this. And yours might change depending on, exactly how high it was, but it doesn't even really matter. If you want to clip off a chip, if it looks better to you, or you'd rather have it a little bit, thinner on the bottom, that's totally fine as well. Just find a spot that you like here on the bottom. So I'm going to move mine to about here. I'm not too concerned about this chip here being cut off. Now let's make some broken cobblestones that'll surround the portal. So we're going to hit Shift and A to bring up our add menu. Go to Mesh, and then up here to Cube. And we're going to change the size of this cube to begin with. So I'm going to set my cube size to 0.65 and then hit enter. And then over here, we're going to rename this from cube. We're going to call this cobblestone. So cobblestone, and then hit enter. Now let's move this stone down here in front of the portal. We're actually going to intersect a good bit of this through the bottom here. We don't really care about what's underneath the plane because the only thing we're concerned about is what's going to be seen, which is above. So I'm going to move mine so that it's actually sticking above the plane here about this much. It doesn't need to be perfect. So roughly that high above the plane. And I also want to move it here in front of the portal as well. Now let's scale this stone here so that's roughly twice as wide as it currently is. So we're going to hit S to start scaling, then X to bind it just to the X-axis, and we're just going to scale it up roughly twice as wide. So just eye it up, make it visually about twice as wide. If you're concerned about it not being exactly twice as wide, you can change that down here. So where we see scale, we can just type in 2 and then hit enter, and now we know it's exactly twice as wide as it used to be. Next, we're going to hit Control and then A at the same time. And this will bring up our apply menu. On this menu here, we're going to choose scale. So we're going to apply the scale that we just did. And essentially what this does is it lets Blender know that this is the new default scale for this object. So that it doesn't make the bevels we're going to be added for the chipping stretched out as well. Had we not applied this 2 times scale to the X direction, when we created our bevels would actually come in stretched twice as wide just in the X-axis. So it would make our bevels look a little weird and it might make it more difficult. So by applying it, we now tell Blender, hey, this is the new default. Assume that this is the actual default scale for this object. So when I start beveling it, it'll make a normal 1 by 1 by 1 scale bevel. It won't stretch it along with the object that was also stretched. Now let's go into our top view. This will make this a lot easier when we're placing them. And to get into our top view, we can go up here and just click on the little Z bubble instead of the front view, which was -Y. So we would click Z instead to go into top, or you can hit tilde and then just choose top from your radial menu. We'll start by moving this stone here up underneath our portal a little bit. So it kind of looks like it was sitting on a road that, you know, maybe led to this portal, or it was a pathway in a castle or what have you. But we want to make this kind of part of the environment. And now our goal with these cobblestones here is to just kind of somewhat randomly scatter them around this portal, at least just in the front here, and maybe along a little bit along the sides and the back, to give the impression that there's some sort of environment that led to this portal. It's not just a portal sitting in a completely flat void. It'll make it just kind of feel like it has some sort of context around it. I'm going to speed this portion of the video up, but feel free to follow along with me if you'd like to. Just pause when you need to stop. Okay, so I have all my cobblestones placed, and you can see kind of what I meant about sort of the placement and the area I wanted them to fill them in, and also that kind of sort of loosely laid out like cobblestones, but I really wasn't too concerned about having them butted up against each other and making them really logical and sort of normal like real cobblestones. I wanted them to kind of look like they were in disrepair. So they're offset, they're not completely offset in the correct way for the rows, and their offsets, you know, horizontally are also a little varied. I also left a fair bit of space around each one of them, and that's because of our next step in which we're going to be randomizing them slightly. So let's start by selecting every one of the cobblestones, and that'll be easier to do over here on the list. Select the first one, scroll down, find the last one, hold shift and then select it. It'll select each one in between. And now we can go to Object, Transform, and then Randomize Transform. So now let's rotate out of our top view here so we can get a better look at what these stones are actually doing. And we're going to be changing some of these parameters here because they're obviously not working very well. And that's because we had originally set them up for the portal bubbles, but these stones need something a little different. So we're going to get rid of the location here. We're just going to set this back to 0. So the Y location can go back to 0. And we're going to change the scale so they're not quite so varied. We're going to make this just 0.95. So there's a very slight amount of scale between them. Some are just a little bit bigger than the others, or smaller. And then the main thing we're going to be doing is changing the rotation here actually. So we're going to rotate them randomly on each one of these axes to make them look like some sides of the stones are pushed in a little bit, some are pushed out. They kind of sunk into the ground in different rates for each stone. So we're going to type in 5 for the X rotation, 2 for the Y rotation, and then the Z, we're also going to type in 5 and then hit enter. So now you can see all these stones here, they're all kind of rotated, and it makes the path look a lot more worn and kind of beaten and broken up a little bit. Okay, so that's the extent of the randomization we're going to be doing. The next step is to attach all of these cobblestones together into just one singular object. And since we already have them all selected, we can just hit Control J, and then we can go up here to Object, Set Origin, and then Origin to Geometry, just to center out this pivot so it's a little bit more logically placed in the middle. And then the last thing we're going to do is just go through and chip some of the corners of these stones, because right now these cobblestones, while they're rotated and kind of scaled differently, they're all pretty pristine. They all have perfectly, square, sharp corners. And we don't really want that. We want it to kind of fit in with how the portal has been aged. So we're going to do that exact same process on this. So I'm going to hit Tab to go into my edit mode, and then we can just go through here and hit Control B, V, and just that same normal process we've been doing. And you can see as we bevel this further out, it actually kind of cuts off that corner because it starts going below the surface, and that's totally fine. So I'm just going to bevel this out and make some more interesting chips on this corner to kind of knock some of these corners off, maybe give some of these edges a little bit of a broken edge. And we're going to do that to each one of these stones. You don't have to bevel every single corner, just pick out some, random ones along this path here, and just make the path look a little bit more aged. I'm going to speed up this video because at this point, this is the 3rd time that you've done this exact same process, so it should be pretty familiar for you. I'll see you in a moment. Okay, so I've finished chipping all of the individual cobblestones. Now the last thing to do is to apply the Bevel Modifier, such as the one that's on the portal base currently, to the cobblestones. So we'll have the cobblestones selected first, then we can hold Shift and select the portal base. Now hit Control L, and then choose Copy Modifiers. So now when we do that, we'll see that the modifier has been copied to the cobblestones. And the last thing we need to do is just apply the auto smooth. So with the modifier on, we can go down here to the object data properties, the little green triangle, scroll down to normals, make sure that's twirled open, and then check auto smooth. And that'll smooth out the individual corners that have been beveled as well. With the environment created, we're officially done modeling for the rest of this tutorial. In the next episode, we'll texture our scene using stylized shaders. I'll see you there. Don't forget to click the link in the description and comments below for a free month of Skillshare. Watch my classes as well as thousands of others across a wide variety of topics. For the sake of transparency, I do receive a small amount of money if you decide to continue your subscription after that first free month. I truly appreciate the support. If you're enjoying the tutorial series so far, like the video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're notified when I release new content just like this.